Hello and welcome. This is Leah. I'm the Development and Communications Manager at SCI Social Capital Inc. Thank you for tuning in to the SCI Cultivating Connections podcast, where we highlight creative initiatives that bring communities together, as well as strategies that you can use to build bridges across differences. The show is hosted by SCI founder and president David Crowley. In today's episode, David is joined by one of our 2025 SCI Idealist honorees and an old friend, Marinell Rousmaniere, CEO of EdVestors. We are thrilled to be recognizing Marinell, along with Ron Dorsey, at our SCI Idealist celebration coming up on May 7th. Make sure to check out our website for more information and to grab your tickets.
Hello, Marinell. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm so glad to be here with you today, David. So nice to see you.
Yeah, this has been fun. As we'll talk about, we're honoring you at SCI's big annual event coming up on May 7th. We've known each other since high school, but we don't see each other that often or get to connect. So it's been a good excuse to connect a little bit more, and including Absolutely. This conversation about the good work you're doing at EdVestors.
Absolutely. It was a real delight to get this news, and your connection here means a lot. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, but let's start. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of EdVestors. Some might be more familiar than others with the work. For those that are not so acquainted with it, could you start by just giving a brief couple-minute overview of what EdVestors is all about?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So EdVestors is a school improvement nonprofit located in Boston with a focus on Boston. We combine strategic philanthropy, implementation support, and education expertise to drive change at the system level. We work at scale to spread improvement in 3 issue areas: arts education, math education, and career pathways in secondary schools through post-secondary. We have been seeding work at the school level and at the district level around racial equity efforts. Mm-hmm. And we spotlight school improvement. One of the things folks know us most for is a prize we give every year called the School on the Move Prize, given to the most improving Boston public schools to shine a light on the good work that's happening.
That's great. Yeah, you talk about, I know obviously Boston Public Schools, like other big urban school districts, is a big system. So yeah. And you've been at EdVestors for, it looks like, over 15 years now, mm-hmm. in different capacities. What would you say when you think about system change? What's something that's really important to keep in mind to do systems change work in public education?
That it's really important to do. I think there's been a narrative, and it's particularly pronounced now, to sort of walk away from public education and look at what's difficult and sort of wash your hands. That in Boston in particular, there are 47,000 students in the public schools every day here in the city. So the work is really important. It is not fast, but it is also possible and requires all of us working together in order to make it happen.
That's great. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you can't you need a big team. Need a big team for a big system like that. So as I said, you've been there a while. What attracted you personally to the work and at EdVestors, and what's kept you there? That's longevity in this or any sector these days.
Yes, and unexpected. So my entire career has been in the education space, both in the out of school time space and in the during the school day space. And I came to EdVestors on what I thought was going to be an 18-month stop on a consulting phase of my career. The work that I love, that we'll talk more about, because I think it's connected to social capital, is really bringing different sectors together to work together to mm-hmm. have the sum at least equal to, if not greater than, its parts. Yeah. I had worked on a couple of projects helping to launch the College Completion Initiative here in Boston, and working at Boston After School and Beyond in its moment of transition. And a couple of folks who have been key in my career, Claire Shaw, who is a longtime philanthropic leader, and Laura Perrill, who was the previous CEO, said, hey, we're going to get this big grant to do this arts education planning process. you've worked with this foundation before, like, would you be interested? And I said, sure, sounds like you've built this the right way. And so I'll join you for 18 months. And as you alluded to, that was 15 years ago. And what has kept me here when I stayed on staff and then stepped into the CEO role almost 7 years ago is kind of simple, which is the work and the people. That cross-sector work, it just became clear to me over the journey of my career that's the piece that I love the most, is really bringing people together to make the kind of change. And the team of people and sort of the culture at EdVestors, while it's changed a lot over the 15 years, it's just like simply a great group of folks to work with and to do this kind of work with.
Yeah, that's great. The people have to be enjoyable to spend time with. Obviously, put in a lot of hours, and if you don't enjoy working with them, you're not going to stay. Yeah. You're not going to stay and be happy. At the very least, I suppose there's some people that feel stuck in a place where they don't love their colleagues, but you clearly radiate enthusiasm for it. So that's a good sign for your team.
Absolutely.
Great. Clearly, as we were talking about before we started recording, there are a lot of unique challenges in 2025. Running a nonprofit's never easy, especially one trying to do big, important system change work as you are at EdVestors. But talk about, what's top of mind for you in 2025, given all the policy changes and so forth that we're facing.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I'll say is I think we've gotten practiced at next level changes and challenges after being in the pandemic era and all of the things that brought. If you had told me 5 years ago that I was going to have this conversation with you over Zoom, I would have been like, what's that? Sometimes people send me one of those links. I don't use it. We, I think, have gotten good at pivoting and getting more confident at dealing with challenges, but these are new and particularly formidable. I think that because of our work with public systems, we're a half a step away from their realities, but I'm very attuned to, the kinds of things that the Boston Public Schools and our higher ed partners and our nonprofit partners are facing in terms of threats around immigration, around federal funding. And, I think there's like broader economic concerns that are also on the horizon for all of us. I think very specifically, I mentioned our work around career pathways, which is a very significant body of work that we have been doing that, interestingly, we launched essentially as the pandemic began, that we brought together this cross-sector partnership to stand up more career pathway opportunities, more work-based learning, more kinds of dual enrollment in early college with an equity focus. And the first meeting on Zoom, we said, like, are people going to come to this meeting? Like, they're dealing with trying to feed students and get them laptops, and folks came and they said, no, this work is sort of more important than it was 2 weeks ago because of the kinds of economic stability and accessibility we want young people to have. So that is a big challenge as we're kind of at the end of 5 years of a major funding infusion that we had. We've made lots of progress. We've been planning on what that next phase looks like and fundraising around it, but it just got a whole lot more complicated in terms of where those public systems are. But I think, again, what we've heard from folks, including 300 people we gathered yesterday who serve as advisors to students in Boston, like, this is, again, more important than ever because we want people to be equipped for the future that we want to create.
Yeah, that's great. I can see where to some extent, I mean, it's just the optimist in me, but thinking how the pandemic did, I mean, it really forced, I mean, you were moving toward, obviously, as some system change, thinking out of the box in terms of how young folks make the transition after high school. But I think it kind of broke a lot of the way things work. So maybe the timing actually was pretty good potentially. And I also appreciate the idea of taking it can sometimes, I mean, it felt like, I mean, I think when the pandemic hit, if, you know, and in many ways it was unprecedented. Of course, there have been pandemics before, not in our lifetime, but I think it's wise to think about, yes, there are major disruptions, a lot of things to stress about right now. But if it's, you know, if we can think, if we learned something from this other challenging phase we went through, it feels like that's a little source of resilience.
Agreed. And we can do it, at least this time, in present community, which I think if I learned something, and I, given your work building social capital, I'm sure that's true for you, you know, that it goes further faster.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely, which is a good segue. I know you've done some work thinking about the intersection of social capital and public education, including a project that's called Reimagining Social Capital in Boston. I want to say, give us a little flavor for, you know, either that project specifically or just in general. So your thoughts on how social capital plays into helping young people succeed in public education?
Yeah, I think it plays a really big role, and is related in many ways to the career pathways work that I talked about. It plays a big role in lots of ways. It's about, you know, any of the work in education is really fundamentally about relationships. But when we think about flattening the road for high school students to make more informed decisions based on experiences and exposure to get to post-secondary, whatever that looks like, college training programs, apprenticeships, that then connect them to a family-sustaining wage, career pathway, right? That is a lot about relationships. And one of the things that has so that you could build the programs and the coursework and the data, but through the work that the city has done over the last decade and a half around college completion, you know, we have a lot of data around that. And one of the things that struck me a few years ago, and I think has animated my connection to this issue, is that we know that students of color, particularly Black and brown males, even if they've done all the things that they have been asked, finish high school, go to college, finish college, they are undermatching in the labor market. They essentially end up with a job from a wage standpoint the same as sort of a white high school graduate, right? And so you think about, like, what are the factors behind that? Right. It's like, what work experience did they have while they were in high school? Did they have to keep working at Target or CVS, right, to keep things going for their family versus being able to take the internships that only last for a few weeks? Right. Did they create do they see the relationships they already have as assets and use those relationships and the connections that they provide to build new relationships that might provide them the stairway to that next opportunity? So I think the cultivating connections work that you talked about in the Reimagining Social Capital piece that was a part of our broader pathways work, there's sort of a tagline when it comes to careers: who you know is as important as what you know. Right. And so having that asset-based approach to the relationships of, like, who's in your neighborhood, who's on your, who do you know from high school? What's the mentoring piece? How do we use the state, my career and academic plan as sort of a foundational piece to, like, spur these kinds of conversations with young people, is all part of this pathways work.
Yeah, that's great. And I like that asset-based approach, because I think sometimes when we are thinking about social capital and how that might create different outcomes based on who has access, it's almost like, I guess, kind of more of a fixed mindset approach, where it's like either you have these connections or you don't. How can we build these connections, but actually helping young people think about connections they already have, and maybe some skills around how to leverage, or at least mindsets around how to leverage those for help them achieve their goals. That's great. Definitely.
Our colleagues at Bunker Hill Community College use this framework around cultural wealth that I think a lot of us in this work has learned from and has a lot of that frame, that there's so much wealth in the communities they come from, in the cultural backgrounds that they have, and seeing those assets is a critical piece.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's exciting. So makes it sync up well for us to be honoring you at Social Capital Inc.'s annual event, which is on May 7th, just to plug that again and hope the listeners can join us. But I did want to ask, talking about another award, you referenced it earlier about the School on the Move Prize, which is a big part of your work, as I understand. I'd love to hear how you think about why that helps advance your mission, and maybe like any key characteristics, your top 2 or 3 things that you find tend to be consistent across schools that win that award each year.
This is such an important question. Both the key characteristics, but I'll share a little bit about School on the Move and how we see it advancing our mission. It's not so different than what we were just talking about in terms of an asset-based approach. If you read the media, you will read a story, if not 3 a day, about the things that are not going well in public education, and in public education in cities in particular. But the truth is, as it always is, that there's a much broader story, and that in Boston in particular, there are bright spots of schools that are really delivering for young people, are in terms of their academic growth and other areas of growth and improvement. And so that the way that we see this advancing our mission is that it really is a bit of a sort of bucking the narrative, providing other narratives about what's happening in our schools, about the assets of our students and our educators, and about what's possible, and shining a light on those things so for a more fulsome kind of story about what's happening, and to study what those schools are doing through documentation and research, so that other schools just like them can learn from it and use it as a blueprint for improvement. And what we've learned from that work that really syncs up with some work that's been done nationally, particularly in Chicago by Tony Bright, is that there are key characteristics, and they're kind of not rocket science, and they're not a new, shiny object, but they are about having facilitative leaders. They're collaborative teachers, a real focus on instruction and the kind of support for students that's necessary, the use of data, and family and community partnerships that surround that. And if you have those pieces, they sound simple, but they're not easy to do. But if you have a relentless focus on those practices, schools can improve.
That's great. Yeah. And so it sounds like, I think I saw this somewhere on your website too, there's like a research piece related to, or communicate. So you're somehow sharing or codifying the best practices that you see at the schools you're recognizing.
Sometimes we do that in a singular school case study. Sometimes we look across schools. So the sort of lifting up of those practices that I talked about. We did some seminal research at our 5-year mark and our 10-year mark, really looking at those that really lifted up those practices, have looked at the practices of teacher collaboration. So doing that research and sharing it with the field is a big part of that work.
That's great. Excellent. Well, speaking of school, I mentioned you and I met in high school. We weren't at the same high school, but we went through the same youth leadership program called the Hugh O'Brien Youth Leadership Seminar, HOBie affectionately for short. So we both know the value of, extracurriculars and focusing on leadership development. That's actually a big part of SCI's work, as not exclusively with young people. We do work with all ages, but a lot of our work does center around developing young leaders and enabling them to make a difference in communities. So given that, we both benefited from extracurriculars and leadership development, curious, any thoughts you have on how we can do more, and how you see, I know sometimes we've found some data for grants we're writing on, sort of some, maybe some limitations on what's available for extracurriculars for BPS students versus, folks coming maybe from some of the suburbs. And, any ways to close those gaps in opportunity?
Yeah, I think, as you said, you benefited, I benefited deeply from a set of extracurricular opportunities in my high school and college days. And my career has been sort of animated by this like opportunity gap closing notion. And it's a big part of our work around arts education, our work in the pathways space. And I think there are a couple ways to sort of go about this question. One of them is like the work that you do, which is organizations that are on the ground providing leadership opportunities, whether it's the kind of like traditional leadership, right, that you and I did at least in one facet of our careers, or if it's playing squash at Squash Busters, or music at Zoom Mix, or being a peer leader at Hyde Square Task Force. There are amazing opportunities, and we need sort of the way we come at it at EdVestors, which is more in school, but a lot of it is connected to some of these extracurricular, is how we measure how much of that is available, and how we make a more system approach so that there aren't, David and Marinell who are getting 5 things, and then 20 students who are getting nothing. And I think that's often more the story in Boston, which is we have sort of such a rich tapestry of opportunities, but it doesn't get communicated and outreach to all of the students who could benefit from it. So I think that notion of sort of convening and coordinating and collaborating in ways to make that more systematized and to get to more students is a big piece of the work here in Boston.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, because I find it wasn't in Boston. Actually, these students I'm thinking of are in Lynn Public School, so it's somewhat similar demographic, but they were in our youth pitch contest last year, and there's 3 high school seniors. They were clearly had availed themselves of every, they were in La Vida Scholars. They were in, figure out how to get into our program, and, squeezing us in between, getting SAT.
Their early college class, and
it's wonderful. They're all students of color, first gen. So it's like, great. That's awesome that they're availing themselves of all that. But I just kind of wonder, it'd be interesting. I don't know if you've seen, I'm thinking out loud here. Sorry, this is not a planned question, but I'm thinking like, I haven't seen, it'd be interesting if it hasn't already been done to sort of see like what's the difference in terms of who's, I'm sure some of it's some intrinsic motivation, but I suspect, maybe some of, these young people I'm thinking of maybe had some people in their lives that are helping steer them to these opportunities. But like you say, it should be more systematic. So everybody gets a shot. I don't know if you've seen any initiatives to address it, or research, or any thoughts on that.
I mean, I've seen schools that have sort of teams of folks, particularly at like the post-secondary planning level. So they've brought together the adults who work in the building with the partners to say like, okay, here's the juniors here, like who's connected to whom. And sometimes you need, like, it's not just like spread the peanut butter, right? Because it can be that you need those 3 or 5 opportunities to really launch you to the next place. But who's not being served in that? How are we better connecting them? I have seen, and in the school space in particular, those kinds of teams come together to help be more intentional about that outreach and support to students.
That's great. Yeah, if they're teaming up, maybe really, have a better sense holistically of what kids are accessing or not accessing. Great. Well, gee, I know we could talk about, all the things that are great things going on in public education. The more that needs to be done could take us well into the evening, but I know our time is short here. So I wanted to, as I often like to do, sort of covered a lot of ground: education, leadership, social capital. If you had to, sum up some parting words of wisdom for us, whether sometimes we have one panel, somebody like to give your advice in 5 words. I'll give you a sentence or 2 if you want. If you think about what you have learned, how you see social capital, or the theme cultivating connections, applies to people who want to make a difference in their communities, and especially supporting public education.
When you posed this question to me, all I could think about was you never know where a connection will take you. So treat everyone with care. I have I could go on the rest of the evening telling you about the intern, the neighbor, the student, the person you met in high school who, was a couple years older than you and a leader in the group who would become, the leader of a nonprofit, the cabinet secretary, for the governor, all the things. And so the sort of magic of the connections is getting to know the people and then having that kind of mutuality and you just don't know where it will go. And it's some of the greatest little joys in life is to see where those connections take you.
That's great. Well, that is great parting advice. Before we totally close, I realize I didn't ask this yet. And just if you could, if somebody's intrigued by the work, particularly, I assume, somebody anywhere could learn from your work, but particularly for folks in the area, any sort of, whether it's calls to action, how people, learn more, any suggestions, if you've whet somebody's appetite, how they get more of a meal of this important content. I don't know if you want to just go out on this, how to find more.
Well, come visit our website. I guess that's home base and for EdVestors.org. And you can learn more about our School on the Move Prize, which will be in November at Fenway Park. That might be something people would be interested in attending. And just to read the research about our School on the Move Prize, learn more about our arts or career pathways or math and racial equity work, and be in touch.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Marinell. It's been wonderful catching up and gleaning some insights from you in the conversation.
Always great to chat with you, David. Thanks so much. I'm really honored.
Thank you for tuning in for today's episode of the Cultivating Connections podcast from SCI. For resources and links, visit socialcapitalinc.org/podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast player so you don't miss an episode, and give us a rating. We hope you gain some insight and inspiration from the show that helps you connect with your community. Until next time, stay connected.